For over 100 years now, William Butler Yeats has been the poet we turn to when the world feels like it's falling apart. When things feel chaotic and out of control, his words are often the ones that come to mind. And it usually starts with a few very famous lines.
Yeah, these lines. They've become our cultural shorthand for societal collapse, haven't they? They felt right on the money after the chaos of the First World War, and honestly, they feel just as relevant in our crazy world today. When things go sideways, we look to Yeats to give it a name. But what if the way we've always understood his most famous poems is missing a huge piece of the puzzle? What if the chaos he was describing wasn't just about politics and war, but about something way more personal and a whole lot more terrifying? To figure this out, we've got to dig a little deeper into two of his most iconic works. And get ready, because we're about to uncover some seriously counterintuitive takeaways that are probably going to change how you see W.B. Yeats forever. We're going to find out that a poem we all thought was a quiet retreat was actually a fierce political protest. And then we'll discover that a poem we were sure was about war was secretly being fueled by the terror of a global pandemic. So, this first story, it all starts with a simple request made to Yeats during a time of war and his very, very strange public refusal. Okay, so picture this. The year is 1915. World War I is just tearing Europe to shreds. The pressure on artists to, pick a side is absolutely immense. And a group of famous writers asks Yeats for a patriotic poem, for a book, to help war refugees. A good cause, right? Seems almost impossible to say no to. But Yeats's response was, well, not what anyone expected. He said no, but he did it by writing this short poem about saying no. At first glance, it just looks like he's trying to elegantly stay out of the fight. But believe me, it was so much more than that. What seems like this passive, apolitical move was actually a deeply thought-out, highly political act of protest. This wasn't him avoiding the issue. This was his statement. And here's why. First off, Yeats believed a poet's job was to dig for complex truths, like, say, the shared humanity of soldiers on both sides of a war, not to just pump out simple rah-rah nationalist slogans. But second, and this is absolutely crucial, Yeats was a fierce Irish nationalist. He was being asked to write propaganda for the British Empire, the very empire that had oppressed his people for centuries. For him, writing that poem would have been a total betrayal. His silence was actually a roar of artistic and national independence. But that silence, it wouldn't last. Just 4 years later, in 1919, Yeats unleashed The Second Coming, which is, arguably, the most terrifying political poem of the 20th century. And the traditional way we read this poem has always been pretty straightforward. I mean, the Great War had just ended, the Russian Revolution was in full swing, and Ireland's own War of Independence was tearing the country apart. The center, it sure seemed, was truly not holding. Okay, but this is where our story takes a really dramatic turn, because some groundbreaking research suggests that this political reading totally overlooks a devastating reality that was hiding in plain sight the entire time. Just take a look at this timeline. The timing here is absolutely everything. The Second Coming wasn't just written after the war. It was written right at the peak of the deadliest pandemic in modern history, the 1918 Spanish flu. This whole idea comes from the work of a scholar named Elizabeth Autka. Her theory of viral modernism basically argues that the pandemic was the raw emotional fuel for this poem's apocalyptic vision. And here's why this is so critical. For Yeats, this wasn't some abstract story in the news. It was an intimate, personal terror. Just weeks before he wrote those famous lines, his pregnant wife, Georgie, was struck down by the flu and was literally near death. His fear must have been just unbearable. During that pandemic, the mortality rate for pregnant women was catastrophic, as high as 70% in some areas. 70%. Yeats was watching his own personal world, his family, face complete and utter annihilation. So, with that context, the poem's famous images suddenly transform from these grand metaphors into something shockingly literal, a biological horror story. Let's take this line. We have always read it as a metaphor for the bloodshed of war. But the reality may have been much more clinical. One of the main symptoms of this particular strain of flu was catastrophic hemorrhaging. A patient's lungs would fill with fluid until they literally drowned in their own blood. So the blood-dimmed tide wasn't just some poetic symbol. For Yeats, it was a gruesome medical reality that he might have been witnessing in his own home. And how about this line? The loss of innocence, of goodness. It feels so abstract. But for Yeats, it really wasn't.
The word drowned becomes terrifyingly literal. For Yeats, as he's watching his pregnant wife struggle just to breathe, the ceremony of innocence was the life of his unborn child, which was threatened with being extinguished in the most horrific way you can imagine. And this reveals a really key difference. In a war, the enemy is human. It has a face. But a virus? It's formless, it's invisible, and it strikes without any reason or discrimination. It's a perfect match for the poem's rough beast, whose gaze is blank and pitiless as the sun. This wasn't a human enemy, it was a biological one.
Now, this interpretation doesn't cancel out the political one, not at all. It actually deepens it. The fear of the world ending becomes so much more real when your own world is ending in your own house.
And maybe the final piece of evidence is hidden right there in the poem's drafts. Early versions actually mention specific historical figures, but in the final version, Yeats deliberately took them all out. He made the source of the chaos abstract, faceless, and inescapable, just like a virus. Which really leaves us with a final haunting question. In our world today, with all of its own political turmoil and the lingering fear of pandemics, does Yeats's century-old poem feel like some historical artifact? Or does it feel like maybe that rough beast is, even right now, slouching our way?